Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. Tonight, I'm going to be reading through some chapters in Social and Cultural Dynamics by Pitirim Sorokin. And for those who aren't aware, he is a cyclical sort of sociologist and historian. Looks a lot of what he calls fluctuations in the culture of the West and the different elements that are mixed in to create it and how these change over time. By way of an introduction, for those who aren't aware, I'm going to be reading a few pages from the Sorokin chapter in Prophets of Doom by Academic Agent, because it's quite a good introduction to Sorokin, and that's actually how I first discovered him. So, prophets are lonely men. They have disciples, but no peers. They see what can be, perhaps ought to be, and attempt to move their brethren toward that vision. They are intemperate, challenging, and difficult, that they are also necessary. Pitirim Sorokin, 1889 to 1968, was by all accounts a formidable but competitive and polarizing character. No man who writes two autobiographies, Leaves from a Russian Diary, 1924, revised in 1950, and A Long Journey, 1963, can be said to be wholly self-effacing. Or as another commentator put it more bluntly, he had an ego as large as the vault of heaven. Unlike most of the other prophets of doom we have discussed thus far, he spent most of his career working in the academy, although as we shall see, his relationship with colleagues was often dramatically acrimonious and volatile. His life was also incredibly storied. He was born as a penniless peasant in the far north of Russia. His mother was of the Komi people, and he died when he was 3. His father was an alcoholic, and he left home at the age of 10. After winning a scholarship at a local village, he was able to acquire schooling for himself and studied at the Psychoneurological Institute at St. Petersburg. Here he became increasingly involved in anti-Tsarist revolutionary political activism and was arrested several times for writing subversive literature. Most remarkably, Sorokin served in the Russian provisional government under Alexander Kerensky following the February 1917 revolution. He was high-ranking. When the communists took over in November 1917, many of Sorokin's political friends were shot and killed. Sorokin himself was arrested in January 1918 on the false charge of the attempted assassination of Vladimir Lenin. He was released after 57 days, but he had to live as a fugitive in the forests. He was arrested multiple times by the communists and suffered starvation and bitter cold. Lenin personally ordered his release after several people had lobbied for it on the basis that the Soviet Union could not afford to lose its intellectuals. Sorokin was allowed to resume his studies and pass his doctorate in 1922. However, the communists had changed their minds and banished non-conformist scholars, and Sorokin was exiled. He left for the USA and eventually landed a post at the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. He was then invited to Harvard in 1929 to accept a new chair in sociology. During the next decade, he would produce his masterpiece, the 4-volume Social and Cultural Dynamics, 1937, which will be the text on which we'll be focusing. Sorokin retired from his chair in 1944 and established the Harvard Research Center in Creative Altruism. He published copiously on altruism and topics such as the cultural impact of sex over the next decade. He proved to be influential on the American conservative movement in the 1950s, and later figures as diverse as former US Vice President Mike Pence and the Russian political philosopher Alexander Dugin frequently featured in the media as an influence on Vladimir Putin. Sorokin was relentlessly pilloried by the academic establishment, and especially by his colleagues in sociology, for his advocacy of cyclical history. They had been hostile to Spengler, but he was an outsider. Sorokin was on the inside, and at Harvard no less, and he did the unforgivable to challenge the progressive orthodoxy. We will turn to the torrid reception of dynamics shortly, but Sorokin was a fighter and did not take any of it lying down. And yet another remarkable episode of his storied life, after being left off the ballot for the presidency of the American Sociological Association in the 1960s, he and his former students organized a writing campaign, and Sorokin pulled off what was in effect a coup. He thus ended his career as the president of the American Sociological Association, despite the bitter opposition of many of his colleagues. This sort of thing is more typical in academia than the general public might imagine. Nonetheless, the establishment got its revenge by virtually writing Sorokin out of the canon in the years following his death in 1968. Although there's been something of a resurgence of interest in the past decade or so, especially in Russia. Before we get to the details of dynamics, it is worth stressing just how thoroughly the book was attacked by the sociological profession. Sorokin went from being one of the most highly respected sociologists in America in the mid-1930s to being almost completely ignored by 1951. Then there's a quote: "Who reads Sorokin? Whatever the answer to the question, sociologists are generally not included in the attentive group. To be sure, social mobility and contemporary sociological theories are frequently cited by sociologists and are used by them in teaching and research, but the dynamics in all its progeny are lost in sociological limbo. They are no longer criticized, simply ignored. Many reviewers of dynamics seemed intent on making Sorokin an object of ridicule. Several barely covered their disdain or contempt, while others let it show, almost with pride and satisfaction. One gets the impression that critics wanted to hurt, denigrate, and completely discredit him. Almost immediately upon its appearance, Professor Sorokin's monumental treatise was greeted by that barrage of adjectives peculiar to hack reviewers and literary procurers. It was attacked by the Marxians. It was even shafted in the New Yorker. One only sees reactions like this to a text that attacks a sacred value. In this case, the value in question was a belief in progress. The reviewers were serving as antibodies for the American establishment for whom progress had become manifest destiny. They do not even entertain the prospect that it may be otherwise, although more cynical commentators have noted that they might have had one eye on their own professional careers. Sorokin achieved little more among modernists than a reputation for raising disagreeable questions. The cards he held constituted no winning hand for the games most social science professionals were playing." And that is the end of the introduction bit I wanted to read from. So you can see Sorokin was very much attacked in his time for a lot of the arguments he's going to make in this book. I'm going to be reading some segments from, essentially for just attacking the idea of progress, and where have we heard that before? I see many friends are in the chat. We've got Youth the Eunuch, and we've got Nami El Kazan. Thank you all for watching. So let me just get my screen up. Okay, let's zoom that in a bit. Okay. So with this first chapter, it's called Ideational, Sensate, Idealistic, and Mixed Systems of Culture. And so these are the three key concepts of Sorokin, which he lays out in Social and Cultural Dynamics. And essentially, ideational and sensate are the two key elements in human culture. And what idealistic is when these two elements are harmonized perfectly within culture. And that is what Sorokin's sort of preferred type of human culture is. And we'll get more into that in a bit. 1. The internal and external aspects of culture and methods of reading them. The elements of thought and meaning which lie at the base of any logically integrated system of culture may be considered under two aspects, the internal and the external. The first belongs to the realm of inner experience, either in its unorganized form of unintegrated ideas, volitions, feelings, and emotions, or in its organized form of systems of thought, woven out of these elements of the inner experience. This is the realm of mind, value, meaning. For the sake of brevity, we shall refer to it by the term mentality of culture, or culture mentality. The second is composed of inorganic and organic phenomena, objects, events, and processes which incarnate or incorporate or realize or externalize the internal experience. These external phenomena belong to a system of culture only as they are the manifestations of its internal aspect. Beyond this, they cease to be a part of integrated culture. This means that for the investigator of an integrated system of culture, the internal aspect is paramount. It determines which of the externally existing phenomena and in what sense and to what extent become a part of the system. In other words, it controls the external aspect of the culture. Deprived of its inner meaning, the Vilis and Mino becomes a mere piece of marble identical in its physiochemical qualities with the same variety of marble and a state of nature. A Beethoven symphony turns into a mere combination of sounds, or even into a vibration of airwaves of certain lengths to be studied by the laws of physics. Aristotle's metaphysics becomes a material paper object, a book, similar to millions of other books. Deprived of this internal aspect, many phenomenal, fundamentally different in their cultural nature become similar. The action of a surgeon plunging his knife into the body of his patient and that of a murderer knifing his victim become indistinguishable on account of the likeness of their external forms. Several questions may now arise. Can we grasp the internal aspect of a given culture adequately, since it is somewhat elusive and often inferential, in the sense that in order to grasp it, one has to read it in external vehicles which differ from the internal meaning? How can we be sure that our reading is correct, that we do not superimpose on a given configuration of external cultural phenomena meanings which are not there? The answer to the above questions depends on what is meant by the true or real mentality incorporated in a given complex of external vehicles. Out of several possible kinds of real meanings, the following may be mentioned. The term real meaning can refer to the state of mind of the person or group of persons creating or using given external vehicles. For instance, the meanings which Beethoven had in mind in the composition of his music, or which Dante kept before him in writing the Divine Comedy, or which are intended by any other creator or modifier of a complex containing cultural value. Here we have the psychological interpretation of what is the real meaning of a given phenomenon. According to this point of view, the correct reading of the internal aspects of culture is that which regards it exactly in the same way as it was regarded by its creators or modifiers. So what he's really getting at here is that when looking at culture, there's two elements. There's the external and the internal. Regardless of what the external is, what is the internal element is far more important, because that is what defines the nature of something. So as you said there, externally, a surgeon cutting open a patient, or murderer stabbing a victim with a knife, externally, the same actions being performed, the human body's being cut by this, sharp instrument. But what matters is the intent of the cutting, fundamentally. Just got a comment from Shreeve Goji. So given his backing of the provisional government, it seems that he wouldn't be so much of a foe to the modern academia. Did he change his mind after the Soviets took the helm? Well, when the Soviets took over, they considered, anyone associated with the provisional government as an enemy, hence why he would have been locked up and had to go on the run. To me, it seems weird that he would agitate against the Tsar's government and then go on to be a pariah in Western academia. That would tint him either as a liberal or a populistic socialist. Oh, well, ultimately, there's that trend. People always become more conservative with age, or what you have to bear in mind here, he went from Tsarist Russia to the American Republic. So you can almost say what was considered left-leaning or progressive by Russian standards was considered right-wing or conservative by American standards. So Americans listening may disagree with me, but I think at that time, I don't think that's certainly an inaccurate statement. Right. Okay. But can this be done with any certainty? Can the reading of the creators, the modifiers of any individual or group be correctly restored and restated? In many cases, yes, and for the simple reason, the meaning or purpose is often clearly and explicitly announced by the creator. We can grasp the essential meaning of Aristotle's Politics, or Dante's Divine Comedy, or Newton's Principia, or Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, because it is there in their works, expressed explicitly. The character of the cultural objects in themselves, inscriptions, letters, chronicles, books, memoirs, and other evidences, often furnishes a sufficient basis for the restoration of the original meanings intended by the creators. If this were not so, the whole science of history would have to be discarded, because such a psychological reading of culture is one of the main procedures of history. This then is one way of reading the real mentality of cultural phenomena. It will be used to some extent in the present work. It is not, however, the only form of reading possible. There may also be a sociological, phenomenological reading of the inner aspect of cultural phenomena. This form of interpretation is perhaps more important for my purposes, and for sociologists in general, than that which is purely psychological. What are the essentials of the sociological phenomenological reading? First, there is a causal functional reading of culture, which aims to discover the causal functional relationships between the component parts of a cultural value or complex. Many persons may not be aware of the real causes of their actions, and that there is a causal relationship between their activities and those of their contemporaries. They may not be aware of the causal connection between many of the variables in their cultural scheme, yet such causal relationships may exist. It is in the privilege of the scientists to discover and to demonstrate their existence. As soon as this is done, the details of a cultural configuration, independently of any psychological meaning which may be given to them, become at once comprehensible as the elements of a causally bound unity. In other words, the first form of the sociological phenomenological interpretation of the mentality of cultural phenomena is the causal functional reading. And Sorokin does love to use a lot of very empirical or scientific language. So I do apologise for any stumbling there. Theoretically, at least, it may be quite independent of the psychological reading. The significance of the relationship between the density of population and the crime, business cycles and the mortality rate, modes of production and forms of property, religion and the divorce rate are examples of the sort of phenomena to which the causal reading may be applied. A second form of the sociological phenomenological interpretation of the internal aspects of culture is the logical reading. We may know nothing about the psychological meaning of cultural values or about their causal relationships. Yet, in regard to many cultural complexes, we can legitimately put the following questions and expect to find satisfactory answers. Are the elements of a given culture logically united, or are they logically contradictory? Do they make a comprehensible and consistent system, or do they not? Do they make a comprehensible and consistent? If they do, what is the nature of the system? Are there unifying principles that permeate all the components of a given configuration or not? These and similar problems may arise and may be answered regardless of any psychological reading of the cultural configuration in question. In many cases, the psychological interpretation helps to discover the logical meaning. Often they go together. Sometimes we cannot say anything about the psychological meaning. Sometimes it clashes with the logical reading. Whatever the situation is, the logical reading stands upon its own feet, theoretically independent of the psychological significance. The necessity for the logical interpretation follows on from the limitations of the psychological reading. The point is, in other words, that most of the cultural phenomena represent the results of the activities of many individuals and groups, whose purposes and meanings may be different from one another, often opposite. They all mix together, partly reinforcing, partly inhibiting, partly modifying one another, to such an extent that there is little likelihood of our distinguishing one from another. Whether we take the Parthenon or one of the great Christian cathedrals or a set of mores or laws or beliefs or any other cultural creations, they are all the manifestations of the activities, efforts, aims, volitions, ideas, feelings of large masses of individuals and combinations of groups. It would be next to impossible to decipher or separate what in these complex cultural values manifests the aims and meanings of each of the participants in their creation, or what is the psychological reading of each. The assumption of the present work is that any cultural complex may be logically interpreted, an assumption made by any scientific study. One special aspect of this assumption deserves, however, to be mentioned specifically. It is as follows. Euclid's and Lobachevsky's systems of geometry are both logically unimpeachable, both follow the canons of the same mathematical logic in the most perfect way. Yet their theorems and deductions differ. How are we to explain such a discrepancy? The answer is simple. Both are logically correct, both follow the same canons of mathematical logic, but they start with different major premises, one with the axiom that the straight line is the shortest distance between the 2 points, the other with a different assumption. This discrepancy at the roots of each system leads to a whole series of differences in subsequent deductions, despite the identity of the logical mathematical canon being applied in both cases. The major premise of each system, once accepted, each is logically valid within its own limits. The principle is particularly important in the field of the logical readings of culture. We may sum up this discussion with the statement that a proper logical reading of cultural phenomena requires, first, the application of the canon of deductive and inductive logic, second, the realization of the possibility that the major premises of various cultures may differ, third, that the assumption of an impartial position in regard to the validity or invalidity of the major premises. If the investigator grasps the characteristic premises of a culture accurately, his main task then is to show to what extent the culture is integrated from the standpoint of these premises, judged by the inflexible canons of logical validity. If he succeeds in solving this problem, his main task is ended. In defining the major premises of a given culture, he illuminates its soul, body, and its social cultural physiognomy by indicating the extent and the character of its logical integration. He answers the question as to its integration or non-integration. In the logical interpretation of culture complexes, this rigorously scientific and impartial attitude is preserved throughout the present work. The canon of logical norms remains the same in the study of all the different cultures, but the logicality or the non-logicality of each is judged always from the standpoint of its major premises, if it has any. A further point in regard to a method suggests itself. If the nature of the major premises of a culture plays such an important part in the qualification of its logical integration, it follows that the key principle by which the character of an integrated culture may be understood should be sought, first of all, in these premises. In any chain of logical judgments, whether in regard to culture or otherwise, the entire series of deductions, and especially the conclusion, are conditioned by the statement with which the chain begins. Thus, in the syllogism, all human beings are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. The choice of Socrates, the statement that he is human, and the conclusion as to his mortality, all are controlled in advance by the original premise, which therefore embodies the key by which the nature of the entire unity, i.e. the syllogism, is characterized. Thus, if we wish to discover the key to such a unity aside from the logic by which it is shaped, we must turn not to the second premise or conclusion, but to the major premise itself. A similar method must be employed in dealing with a logically integrated cultural unity. It's for this reason that in the subsequent pages, which are devoted to preliminary classification of the main types of integrated culture, I shall follow the rule of arranging the types of culture not upon the basis of their secondary characteristics, but according to their major premises. Okay, and then section 2, ideational, sensate, and mixed systems of integrated culture, preliminary definitions. Many systems of logically integrated culture are conceivable, each with a different set of major premises, but consistent within itself. Not all those, however, are likely to be found in those cultural complexes which have been in actual existence, and still fewer will serve as fruitful instruments for ordering the chaos of the cultural worlds, which we can perceive into a limited number of completely comprehensible unities. We can begin by distinguishing two profoundly different types of the integrated culture. Each has its own mentality, its own system of truth and knowledge, its own philosophy and Weltanschauung, or world system or worldview, its own type of religion and standards of holiness, its own system of right and wrong, its own forms of art and literature, its own mores, laws, code of conduct, its own predominant forms of social relationships, its own economic and political organization, and finally its own type of human personality with a peculiar mentality and conduct. The values which correspond to one another throughout these cultures are irreconcilably at variance in their nature, but within each culture all the values fit closely together, belong to one another logically, often functionally. Of these two systems, one may be termed ideational culture, the other sensate. And as these names characterize the cultures as a whole, so do they indicate the nature of each of the component parts. The probability is that neither the ideational nor the sensate type has ever existed in its pure form, but all integrated cultures have in fact been composed of diverse combinations of these two pure, logical, meaningful forms. In some, the first type predominates; in others, the second. In still others, both mingle in equal proportions and on an equal basis. Accordingly, some cultures have been nearer to the ideational, others to the sensate type, and some have contained a balanced synthesis of both pure types. This, the last I term, the idealistic type of culture. I should not be confused with the ideational. Let us now turn to a closer scrutiny of the cultural types we have named. What specifically is meant by the ideational, the sensate, the idealistic, and other intermediary categories? What are their major characteristics? How are these characteristics combined, and how do they operate to give united or integrated systems of culture? And finally, why should these types of culture be regarded as fundamental and capable of providing the best possible meanings of understanding how the millions of fragments of the perceptual socio-cultural world have been integrated into ordered systems? Such are the problems with which we shall start our study. Since the character of any culture is determined by its internal aspect, by its mentality, as we agree to call it, the portraiture of the ideational, sensate, and mixed types of culture begins properly with the delineation of the major premises of that mentality. As a starting point, let's assume that these major premises concern the following four items. 1. The nature of reality. 2. The nature of the needs and ends to be satisfied. 3. The extent to which these needs and ends are to be satisfied. And 4. The methods of satisfaction. A. The nature of reality. The same complex of material objects which compose one's milieu is not perceived and interpreted identically by various human individuals. Without entering here into the psychological, biological, and others reasons for this, let's simply state the fact that the heterogeneity of individual experiences, together with other factors, leads to a multiplicity of the modes of perception of the same phenomenon by different persons. On one extreme is a mentality, for which reality is that we can be perceived by the organs of sense. It does not see anything beyond the sensate being of the milieu, cosmic and social. Those who possess this sort of mentality try to adapt themselves to those conditions which appear to be sense organs, or more exactly to the exterior receptors of the nervous system. On the other extreme are persons who perceive and apprehend the same sensate phenomenon in a very different way. For them, they are more appearance, a dream, or an illusion. True reality is not to be found here. It is something beyond, hidden by the appearance, different from this material and sensate veil which conceals it. Such persons do not try to adapt themselves to what now seems superficial, illusory, unreal. They strive to adapt themselves to the true reality which is beyond appearances, whether it be styled God, Nirvana, Brahma, Om, Self, Tao, Eternal Spirit, Le Arn Vital, Unnamed, the City of God, Ultimate Reality, Ding für und an sich, or what is not of little importance. What is important is that such a mentality exists, that here the ultimate or true reality is usually considered supersensate, immaterial, spiritual. It is evident that the mentality which accepts the milieu in its sensate and material reality will stress the satisfaction of the central bodily needs. Those who see it as a mere appearance will seek the satisfaction, namely, of spiritual needs through an interaction with the ultimate reality. Those who occupy an intermediate position will be sensitive to needs partly sensate, partly spiritual. And therein lies the crux of his model. Ideational culture is a culture that is largely spiritual, whereas sensate culture is a culture that's largely worldly. Ideational is all about the soul or the very spirit or character of the thing. Sensate is purely just about the pure physical representation of it. So, for example, and an idealistic is a harmonization of the two, something that is pure in spirit or valuable in substance, but is also very aesthetically pleasing. And we have actually had a super chat from Shrived Goji for $10. A belated thanks for your edifying work. I look forward to your further talks on Persia. If I may, do look at Constantine Leontiev's Byzantium and Slavdom. He's quite one of a kind. You may like him. Oh, that does sound interesting. Yes, I wouldn't mind delving into Byzantine history one day. So that could be interesting. Thank you for the recommendation, Shrived Goji. And as a follow-up, namely, I deem that he'd make a good subject for archival discourses. His philosophy is grounded on aesthetics, which is so otherwise from the bulk of philosophers nowadays. No, even more reason to be interested, and thank you for sharing that. Okay, B. The nature of the needs and ends to be satisfied. Needs may be viewed as purely carnal or sensual, like hunger and thirst, sex, shelter, and the comforts of the body generally, as purely spiritual, like salvation of one's soul, the performance of sacred duty, service to God, categoric moral obligations, and other spiritual demands which exist for their own sake, regardless of any social approval or disapproval, or as mixed or carnal spiritual, like striving for superiority, scientific, artistic, moral, social, and other creative achievements, partly for their own sake and partly for the sake of human fame, glory, popularity, money, physical security and comfort, and other earthly values of an empirical character. The extent to which these needs and ends are to be satisfied. Each need may be regarded as requiring satisfaction to a different extent or on a different level, from the widest and most luxurious maximum to the narrowest and poorest minimum. One's need for food may range from a small amount of coarse bread and water, barely sufficient to maintain the physiological expenditures of the body, to the most extravagant gluttony, where all means are employed not only to supply luxurious and fine foods, but also to stimulate the satiated appetite by various devices. The same is to be said of clothing, shelter, sex, self-protection, recreation, and amusement. This also holds true for the purely spiritual and for the mixed or carnal spiritual needs. D. The methods of satisfaction of needs. These may be or appear to be different with various individuals. We can divide them roughly into three main classes. One, modification of one's milieu in that matter which will yield the means of satisfying a given need. For instance, one suffering from cold can start a furnace, build a fire, put on a warm fur coat, etc. 2. The modification of self, one's body and mind and their parts, organs, wishes, convictions, or the whole personality, such a way as to become virtually free from a given need, or to sublimate it through this readjustment of self. In the above illustration of suffering from cold, one can train oneself to become less sensitive to cold or to endure it, within considerably broad limits. The same can be said of other needs. 3. Modification partly of milieu and partly of self. In the case of cold, to return to our example, we often resort to both methods. We may light a fire, but also engage in vigorous physical activity to warm ourselves. Okay, now to delve fully into ideational culture. In the terms of the above four items, its major premises are these. 1. Reality is perceived as non-sensate and non-material, everlasting being or sign. 2. The needs and ends are mainly spiritual. 3. The extent of their satisfaction is the largest and the level highest. 4. The method of their fulfillment or realization is self-imposed minimization or elimination of most of the physical needs. And to the greatest possible extent, these major premises are common to all branches of the ideational culture mentality. But on the basis of variations under 4, it is possible to distinguish two fundamental subclasses of the ideational culture mentality and the related culture system. So again, these are all fundamentally spiritual in their nature. A. Ascetic ideationalism. This seeks to the consummation of the needs and ends through an excessive elimination and minimization of the carnal needs, supplemented by a complete detachment from the sensate world, even from oneself, viewing both as a mere illusion, non-real, non-existing. The whole sensate milieu and even the individual self are dissolved in the supersensate ultimate reality. So we can see this in a lot of the culture of the monk, whether it's the Christian monastery or the Buddhist monastery. That's kind of pure sort of metaphysical detachment from the world. You can really see that in Buddhism probably being the most sort of concrete representation of the ascetic ideationalism. B. Active ideationism. Identical with general ideationalism is its major premises. It seeks the realization of the needs and ends, not only through minimization of the carnal needs of individuals, but also through the transformation of the sensate world, especially of the social, cultural world, in such a way as to reform it along the lines of the spiritual reality and of the ends chosen as the main value. Bearers do not flee from the world of illusion and do not entirely dissolve it and their own souls in the ultimate reality, but strive to bring it nearer to God, to save not only their own souls, but the souls of all other human beings. The great spiritual reformers, like the early Christian apostles, such as popes as Gregory the Great and Leo the Great, may serve as examples of the active ideational mentality. Yes, so active ideationism is rather than detaching oneself from the world, you seek to dominate the world and make it purer and more spiritual. Again, him naming their many great popes. But you can think of other, I've recently been doing a series on modern Iran, and Shah Ismail the First is a good example of the active ideational. He wanted to lead this, this Shiite revolution in the Middle East to create a Shiite empire and defeat the Sunnis. And you can see it later in someone like, the Ayatollahs, Ayatollah Khomeini, again, wanting to conduct a more modern Shiite revolution. Okay. 2. Sensate culture. The sensate mentality views reality as only that which is presented to the sense organs. It does not seek or believe in any supersensory reality. At most, in its diluted form, it assumes an agnostic attitude towards the entire world beyond the senses. The sensate reality is thought of as a becoming, process, change, flux, evolution, progress, transformation. Its needs and aims are mainly physical, and maximum satisfaction is sought of these needs. The method of realizing them is not that of a modification within the human individuals composing the culture, but of a modification or exploitation of the external world. In brief, the sensate culture is the opposite of the ideational in its major premises. These traits are common to all varieties of the sensate culture mentality, but on the basis of the variation in the fourth item, i.e. the method of adjustment, it's possible to distinguish between three main varieties of this type. So again, the sensate is purely concerned with the worldly and with the aesthetic, or whatever pleases the eye, if we're using layman terms. Active sensate culture mentality, or Epicureans. Sharing with other forms of sensate mentality or the above four premises, it seeks the consummation of its needs and ends mainly through the most efficient modification, adjustment, readjustment, reconstruction of the external milieu, the transformation of the inorganic, organic, technology, medicine, and the applied disciplines, and the sociocultural world, viewed mainly externally, is the method of this variety. The great executives of history, the great conquerors, builders of empire, are its incarnation. Yeah, so you could think of, someone like a Genghis Khan, for example, or a Tamerlane, or, a Julius Caesar. Or maybe you can even say, another great man of history, say George Washington, the founder of the American Republic, or the founding fathers in general. They all meet this active sensate culture mentality. B. Passive sensate mentality, or passive Epicureans. This is characterized by the attempt to fulfill physical needs and aims, neither through the inner modification of self, nor through efficient reconstruction of the external world, but through a parasitic exploitation and utilization of the external reality as it is, viewed as the mere means for enjoying sensual pleasures. Life is short, carpe diem, wine, women, and song, eat, drink, and be merry. These are the most mottos of this mentality. So again, very kind of, you know, ambivalent, very kind of decadent. It's all about the fulfillment of your desires, fundamentally, the passive sensate mentality. See, cynical sensate mentality or cynical Epicureans. The civilization dominated by this type of mentality, seeking to achieve the satisfaction of its needs, uses a specific technique of donning and doffing those ideational masks, which promise the greatest returns to physical profit. This mentality is exemplified by all the Tartuffes of the world, those who are accustomed to change their physiological colours and to readjust their values in order to run along with the system. Again, I think that very much sums up our modern society. I think we live in a very cynical sensate where there's this sort of faux pretending to be sincere and to have higher values, but really you're just a wealthy sensate fallen person like everyone else, politicians especially. 3. The mixed types of mentality and culture. All the other cultural mentalities represent in their major premises a mixture of the ideational and sensate forms in various combinations and proportions. With one conspicuous exception, they are, therefore, eclectic, self-contradictory, poorly integrated logically. A. Idealistic culture mentality. This is the only form of the mixed class which is, or at least appears to be, logically integrated. Quantitatively, it represents a more or less balanced unification of ideational and sensate, with, however, a predominance of the ideational elements. Qualitatively, it synthesizes the premises of both types into one inwardly consistent and harmonious unity. For reality is many-sided, with the aspects of everlasting being and ever-changing becoming, of the spiritual and the material. Its needs and ends are both spiritual and material, and with the material, however, subordinated to the spiritual. The methods of their realization involve both the modification of self and the transformation of the external sensate world. In other words, it gives sum suik to the ideational and the sensate. Again, so the idealistic is the perfect harmonization of the spiritual and the worldly. B. Pseudo-ideational culture mentality. Another specific form of the mixed type is the unintegrated pseudo-ideational mentality. One might style it subcultural if the term culture was used to designate only a logically integrated system. The nature of reality is not clearly defined, but is felt largely as sensate. Here, needs and ends are predominantly of a physical nature. They are only moderately satisfied, and the method of satisfaction is neither an active modification of the milieu to any appreciable degree, nor a free modification of self, nor a search for pleasure, nor successful hypocrisy. It is a dull and passive endurance of blows and privations coming from the outside, as long as these can be borne physically. This minimization of spiritual and carnal needs is not freely sought, it is imposed by some external agency. It is the result of helplessness to resist. The oppressive power is so overwhelming that after several unsuccessful attempts to oppose it, there remains to those oppressed no energy to try to free themselves and to adapt themselves to physically and spiritually to a better order. Given an opportunity, a pseudo-ideationalist may easily plunge into passive, cynical, or even active Epicureanism. The life processes of slaves under dire and cruel conditions of many prisoners, of subjects under the cruel regime of their rulers, or some primitive people who live in a condition of misery and privation, a group stricken by a great catastrophe, bringing with it utter ruin, or sensate person stricken by an incurable malady. These are, for examples of this type of mentality. And I'd actually say this mentality ultimately describes most normies in the world today. They are fundamentally people who are only concerned with these physical needs, but in a very crude way. And a lot of them, especially our own, people, suffer privations at the hands of migrants and other undesirables, and without really properly understanding why, and just sort of accepting their station in life. It is obvious that an examination of these characteristics of the ideational and sensate culture types is a different problem from that of how these mentalities and their characteristics are distributed in various actual culture complexes and in the actual behaviour of individuals and groups. Our investigation thus falls into two parts or two aspects. 1. The elucidation of the meaning and content of each culture type, as these follow from the major premises. And 2. The discovery of the actual distribution of the characteristics of all types in time and space. In concrete social reality, none of the types which are designated above is often found in pure form, unmixed with others, even in individual or in a group or culture. On the other hand, these types and their characteristics are not distributed identically among individuals, groups, or cultures. In some, the aesthetic ideational, in some, the active ideational, in some, the passive or active sensate, in some, the idealistic predominates. A close examination of the life history of an individual or group would reveal the major current of the flow of its culture patterns. Each of the 7 forms described above and the combination of elements of which it is composed are associated logically and functionally with several additional characteristics. 1. Since the ascetic ideational mentality strives towards the ultimate supersensory reality, lasting, eternal, unchangeable, and not towards the ever-changing and ephemeral sensate reality, it associates itself either with indifference to and a detachment from the physical environment, or the use of trying to adapt oneself to that which is merely illusory, or reluctance to change it, only fools try to ride on waves, or with a contempt for it. Hence, ataraxia, self-sufficiency, apathy, imperturbability and indifference, nirvana, and insensibility to temporal existence, to its pains and pleasures, sorrows and joys, life and death, are traits common to all shades of such mentality. From the Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, Sufist, Jainist, Zoroastrian, Greek, Roman, ascetic, primitive ideationalism, cynicism, skepticism, and in part of at least Stoicism, to ascetic Christianity, and to all other varieties of the ascetic ideational cultural mentalities. And just to add to this, obviously I read a little bit from Prophets of Doom, but one of the other Prophets of Doom, Julius Evola, in Ride the Tiger, that whole book essentially is arguing for a form of ascetic ideational mentality. You have to just detach yourself from the world and liberate yourself from the travails of life. You have to just mentally step over all of it and detach yourself. 2. The above attitude leads logically either to a repression of bodily needs or to detach indifference to them as if non-existent. 3. The attention is turned to the principle of being, views reality as everlasting and unchangeable, being, in contradistinction to ever-changing becoming. The ultimate reality remains eternally the same, unchangeable even in its manifold modifications. Only illusions and appearances change. Empirically viewed, this mentality is thus static in its essence, static in its philosophy, in its Weltanschauung, in its choice of values and behaviour, time in the sense of before and after, past, present, and future, long and short, measured by empirical units. If it does not play any role in such a mentality, or it becomes identical with the eternal, ultimate reality, and as such is punctuated only by the changes in the distance of the ascetic ideational mind from total engulfment by or union with this everlasting being. Quite contrary are the standpoint and satellites of the active sensate mentality. It sees only the empirical reality, full of appetites and vigour. It wants to change the surrounding sensate environment to meet its needs. The empirical reality is ever-changing, is ever in flux. Consequently, the adaptive activities must also vary incessantly. Therefore, this mentality is inseparable from a dynamic, evolutionary, progressive principle. From the earliest representatives of this mentality, from Heraclitus and Lucretius to the modern evolutionists, devotees of transformation, progress, dynamism, movement, mobility, revolution, incessant change, and adjustment, the dynamic principle has regularly been an integral part of the theories and practices of the followers of the active sensate mentality. Here, the time category plays the most conspicuous part, and time perspective is an indispensable trait of a mentality which is historical par excellence. Likewise, in their practical activity, when it is integrated consistently with the active sensate mentality, the internal panacea of such theorists is readjustment. Readjustment by all means, at all times, at all cost. Active ideationalism and the idealistic mentalities occupy an intermediate position between the two extreme standpoints. Active ideationism, side by side with the philosophy of being and eternal value, of externalism, emits some, though subordinated, becoming some interest in the affairs of this world, some empirical activities, and some temporal values, subordinate to, and as it were, a shadowy reflection of the internal. Similar is the position of the idealistic mentality, but it puts more emphasis on becoming, on the empirical, temporal aspects of things and values. Passive sensate mentality is imbued with a still more pointed extreme philosophy of becoming. The past is no more, the future may never be, the present is all that we can be certain of. It's carpe diem with a decisive preference for the values of the given moment rather than any lasting future values. Cynical sensate mentality is somewhat similar to the passive sensate, but being obliged to exert themselves to get what passive Epicureans receive as gifts, the devotees of this type of mentality have to resort to hypocrisy as their technique, and in this lies their principal difference from passive Epicureans. Finally, an enslaved pseudo-ideationalist is here, as in other points, a creature of these circumstances rather than their master. 4. The aesthetic ideational mentality facilitates man's control of himself, especially of his bodily senses and of his emotions, feelings, wishes, lusts. The active sensate mentality leads to man's control of the external world, so far as its material and sensate aspects are concerned, since any externality is apprehended mainly as a material and sensate phenomenon or process. The reasons for this are evident and follow directly from the nature of each mentality. Historically, the character of the first type has been frequently demonstrated by the almost miraculous representation of vital needs in the asceticism of Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, Christians, Jainists, Sufis, not to mention the numberless ascetics affiliated with smaller sects. On the other hand, full-blooded, energetic Epicureans always have been the main transformers of the external milieu, whether it involved pioneering in the wilderness or the organization of business empires, metropolitan centers, political or other organizations. As to the other forms of mentality, the active ideational and the idealistic, each of these types logically combines in itself satellites of both oppositional sorts. Each implies the development of self-control as well as control of environments. The first is stressed more in the active ideational, the second in the idealistic mentality, though in neither is they're stressed to such an extent as in each of their extreme types of sensate and ideational. The passive sensate mentality does not imply either of these controls. It seeks only an uninhibited satisfaction of individual lusts from the given milieu. 5. The ascetic ideational mentality is mainly of an introvert nature, directed upon self and its analysis and modification. The active sensate mentality and its adaptational activities by definition are of an extrovert nature, pointed towards the transformation of the sensate milieu. 6. The ascetic ideational mentality, on the one hand, opens wide the mental eyes and ears to grasp, register, and understand the essence of soul, mind, ultimate reality, God, the devil, good, evil, salvation, eternal value, consciousness, conscience, justice, and so on. One is plunged into this intangible realm. However, an active sensate mentality, on the contrary, dissolves the inner life and inner world into external. In contrast to ideationists, Epicureans view the whole inner life and its processes and all spiritual and immaterial phenomena as either ignorant, delusion, or aberration of a peculiar byproduct, function, effect, resultant, or purely physiological processes in the nervous system or in any other part of the body. An ideationalist spiritualizes the external, even the inorganic world, and Epicurean mechanizes and materializes even the spiritual, immaterial self. The position of the active ideational and idealistic mentalities in this respect is intermediary. Both imply internal and external worlds. The active ideationalists pay more attention to internal and immaterial reality than the idealist. The passive sensate mentality implies a generally narrow tendency to view everything in terms of sensual pleasure and its opposite. With such a view, much of the content of reality is missed. And if people haven't gathered it thus far, but fundamentally what the real problem of human culture is that you get what he calls our fluctuations in human culture. Human culture starts out, or specifically it's the West is what he's talking about in social and cultural dynamics. The Western culture starts out very ideational. It's very pure in spirit, but very crude in its external form. This then gives way to an idealistic period where these two are harmonized. This period often produces the best art and culture. And then after a period of about 200 years, all of the ideational elements start to be stripped away over the centuries until you're left with a purely sensate culture. So if we're going to look at our modern West, the ideational period would be something like, from the fall of Rome up until the early medieval period, so about 500 AD to about 1200 AD. The idealistic period was from about 1200 to 1400 AD, the late medieval period, and then from about 1400 onwards, we get this steady eroding of all of the ideational elements in Western culture. And Sorokin actually believes that the period of 1200 to 1400 AD actually produced the best Western culture. So I mean, think about it. You've got, especially in literature, you've got things such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. You've got a Dante's Divine Comedy. You've got a lot of these High German romances. You've got a lot of got people like Petrarch in Italy. You've also got a lot of in art. You've got a lot of the great Gothic cathedrals are built in this period, for as other examples. And you also get the very beginnings of the Italian Renaissance are going on at this time as well. 7. Each of the types of adaptation discussed implies logically a different conception of self or the ego and its relationship to other forces and agencies. The aesthetic ideational mentality tends to dissolve the self in a universe of impersonal and immaterial reality. The active sensate mentality implies a corporeal conception of self which makes it inseparable from the body. A skeptical or irreligious or disrespectful attitude towards non-material forces and agencies, individual pride and self-reliance in care of the body and its well-being, because it is looked upon as identical with the self and personality. 8. The above being true, it is logically inevitable that the aesthetic ideational mentality will require and stimulate cognition of inner physical and mental processes, not, however, in terms of physiology or chemistry. From the most elementary psychological processes of sensation, perception, recollection, representation, thinking, emotions, wishes, volitions, etc., to the most sublime and subtle experiences of ecstasy, trance, mysticism, suggestion, hypnosis, and others like reunion with the absolute, revelation, divine inspiration, etc., from the simplest ideas about immaterial phenomena to the most difficult conceptions of ultimate reality, the human soul, immortality, God, truth, justice, value, and others which are the concern of the humanitarian sciences, i.e. ethical systems, religions, law, aesthetics, philosophy, and education. Since an ideationalist is, so to speak, everlastingly brooding over such matters, since the knowledge and the understanding of them are the essential for him in his attempt to modify, control, or dissolve his inner self, it is obvious that all this should lead to an increase of the ideationalist's direct experience in these fields of immaterial phenomena. Hence, it will not be surprising later when we discover inductively that the periods of predominance of ideational mentality have always led to a domination in human knowledge of theological, ethical, and other systems of thought which deal with these immaterial and sublime problems. On the other hand, such cultures and periods have regularly been marked by stagnation and regress of the natural sciences and other disciplines dealing with the external sensate material phenomena. For the same reasons, the active sensate mentality is naturally associated with, logically requires and stimulates man's knowledge of the external material world. Thus, in a society or culture which at a given period is predominantly sensate, we must expect a successful development of natural sciences and a blossoming of man's knowledge of the material external world and of the technical inventions for its control. 9. For similar reasons, the whole intellectual, moral, and psychosocial gestalt of the ideational mentality is profoundly different from the active sensate. Ideational truth and its criteria cannot be identical with sensate. What is truth or science for one is often prejudice, ignorance, error, heresy, blasphemy for the other. I mean that's true, especially when you look at the modern sensate scientific world we live in, especially under COVID. You know, all of these people who went along with the lockdowns and you've got to take the jab, they essentially viewed any opposition as a kind of a form of secular heresy. Ideational mentality implies the acceptance of the validity of the inner experience, divine inspiration, mystical union, revelation, pure meditation, ecstasy, trance as the ultimate basis and source of truth. The sensate mentality implies the validity of perception, rests entirely or mainly on man's external sense organs. 2. The ideational wisdom, knowledge, mentality seems to be marked by idealism, spiritualism, quietism, religiosity, organicism, mysticism, indeterminism, I should say, qualitativism. The sensate mentality, knowledge, science is characterized by materialism, empiricism, mechanisticism, determinism, quantitism. Again, the reign of quantity, to go back to René Guénon. 3. An ideationalist is prone to interpret the whole external world according to the patterns and traits of his inner experience. As a result, he spiritualizes the material world, even if its inorganic part. It dissolves it in the inner experience. An Epicurean, on the contrary, materializes and externalizes the inner experience. B. Similarly, And for similar reasons, the moral, social, and other values should be different in these mentalities, since an ideationalist is indifferent to the external world, and is centered at the inner, always immaterial or supersensate world, and since his ideal is to repress his sensual and material needs as much as possible. The external values of material character, which can give but a transient satisfaction of sensual needs, have no or little value for him. He seeks to be independent of them and self-sufficient. He wants to live in the external, imperishable world. His values are of an inner, immaterial character. The reverse is the situation for the sensate mentality. Its criteria of value are the fitness of a given external object, of the way of handling it, and the specific forms of extrovert activity to satisfy mainly sensual needs. He does not want to seek imperishable, everlasting values. Such values are non-values to him, being almost useless for the satisfaction of manifold needs. Life is short, and in short life, the sensual needs are transient. A good meal has value only when one has an appetite and one can enjoy it. Love and sex, again, are of value only when they can be enjoyed. For an old or impotent man, that they are no value at all. Therefore, why miss a chance when it comes and can be enjoyed? Why seek for something eternally lasting, since such a thing either does not exist, or, if it exists at all, provides a much smaller measure of enjoyment than the incessant series of pleasures which follow from the satisfaction of all wishes at the moment of their greatest intensity? In regard to all values, as has been pointed out, the ideationalist places more emphasis on the long-time, permanent values than on those that are immediate, transient, short-lived. His standpoint gravitates to the philosophy of being, everlasting, unchangeable, enduring. After these considerations, the following typical traits implied in ideational and sensate mentalities will be comprehensible. In the field of moral values, the ideational mentality tends to be associated with the values which are absolute, eternal, and everlasting. Ideational moral systems, whatever their secondary traits, are marked first by indifference to or contempt of a low valuation of the external empirical world and its material values. My kingdom is not of this world. And again, you could think about this because, going back to the medieval period, what was the philosophy at the time? It was all theologians, people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. But when you get to the more modern age, you have the Enlightenment, you have people like, Voltaire and Rousseau. It's all devoid of anything spiritual. It's all worldly. The sensate mentality implies and is associated with an opposite type of moral code. It chooses and emphasizes predominantly the sensate, empirical, material values, eudaimonism, hedonism, utilitarianism, sensualism, the morals of carpe diem, of wine, women, and song. These are forms established by the sensate mentality. Man should seek pleasure and avoid pain. Utility is positive, disutility is negative. The maximum pleasure for the greatest number of beings. This is, in essence, the motto of sensate moralists. The second characteristic of the moral systems of a sensate culture type is that they are never absolute, but they are always relativistic, varying according to circumstances and situations. They can be modified, have no sacred, unalterable external imperatives. The third quality of the sensate code is that it has little to do with any transcendental or supersensory values. It either mocks at such values, ignores them, or mentions them only to repudiate them and to bolster up its own principles. D. Logically aesthetic value arts likewise cannot be identical in the ideational and sensate culture mentalities. They should be as profoundly different as are other values, so far as the style of art is concerned, whether it be in painting, sculpture, music, literature, drama, architecture. In the ideational mentality, it is symbolic, its physical exemplars being merely the visible signs of the invisible world and inner values. But in the sensate culture, art must be sensate in form, naturalistic in the sense that its intention is to reproduce objects in a shape which imitates closely that in which they appear to our organs of sense. As to the subjects and aims and purposes of art, they show analogous divergences in the two culture types. In general, sensate art deals with those materials which serve and help to increase the sensate happiness of man. Ideational is the handmaid of religion, absolutistic ethics, external values. So we can really see this in the 19th century when you get things like realist arts. It's all about rendering things in the most realistic way possible, but they're often all very mundane. They're all just, farmers in a field, or just general normal people. There's nothing heroic or deeply spiritual about them. The same difference appears in regard to social and practical values. A regime professing sensate ideals will approve anything that increases the sum total of sensate enjoyment and that leads to man's control over nature. and over other men as a means of satisfying ever-expanding needs. Of special importance in such a state of society is the search for material objects which, under the circumstances, are particularly efficient in bringing satisfaction. As one of the most efficient means has always been material wealth, in a sensate society it is the alpha and omega of comfort, of the satisfaction of all desires, of power, prestige, fame, happiness. With it, everything can be bought, everything can be sold, and everything can be gratified. Therefore, it is quite comprehensible that striving for wealth is inevitably one of the main activities of such a culture, that wealth is the standard by which almost all other values are judged, that it is, in fact, the supreme value of values. Pecuniary value thus becomes the measuring stick of scientific, artistic, moral, and other values. Those who are excellent moneymakers are the leaders of such a society. Those who are wealthy are its aristocracy. They are simultaneously public leaders, high priests, moral examples, kings who ennoble others, the 400 which is envied, if not deeply esteemed. Under these conditions, writers, artists, scientists, ministers, public officials, and men of the professional classes hope and act mainly to write a bestseller, to attain the best paying position, to have the highest scale of remuneration, and so on. If arms and force, not money, are the means to maximum happiness, then these instruments are the supreme arbiters of value instead of money. In this respect, the ideational mentality differs from the sensate once again. An ideationist is either quite indifferent to all these illusory and transient values, or is even inimical to them, as the sources of the disturbances of the peace of mind and of the perdition of the human soul. In a thoroughgoing ideational society, wealth or any other sensate value cannot be dominant, but at best will be tolerated only as a turpitudinous. The most successful dealers in wealth do not have much chance to become the bearers of prestige, the leaders, the evaluators, the assessors of men, objects, and values in such a society. Enough of the contrast for the present. Table 1 will make plain at a glance by its arrangement in tabular form the results of this examination of the several types of culture and mentalities. And again, this is another indictment on our present society. The sensate values wealth above all else, and look at the present state of things. The merchants rule. They are the ones who pull the strings of everything, and everybody just wants to get rich quick. The preceding pages outline the profound differences to various types of mentality, as they fall generally under the heading of ideational or sensate. Based on divergent major premises, they likewise differ throughout. If the implications of the premises are consistently carried through, a consistent adherence to these implications makes each type of mentality logical and integrated according to the same canon of logic, in spite of their contrast. The problems which next face us are these: first, to show that the above types of mentality have had actual historical existence; second, to demonstrate that in these historical cultural complexes, the combination of the elements and satellites of each type was indeed exactly as outlined. When these tasks are done, there still remains another major problem, that of the relationship between mentality and external behavior, manifestation, events, processes, and other externalities of a culture. The point is that the mentality of a given person or group may be quite... I'm sorry, he's got some tables here. Let me just find the text again. Quite consistent and logical, but this does not entitle us as yet to conclude that it will be carried through in the activities, external patterns, and behaviour of the person or group. A man may be a most brilliant commentator on Kant's critique of practical reason, and yet in his behaviour remain a scoundrel of the first degree. And what I now want to do is just look at some of these tables he's got here. Okay, first one, table 1, summary of the main traits and satellites of the discussed types of adaptation. So main elements, reality, and then he says what they mean to each of the types. So aesthetic ideational is the ultimate reality, eternal, non-sensate, transcendental, active sensate, sensate, empirical, material, and it goes on and on. Then we've got the main, needs and ends, extent of satisfaction, and then the method of satisfaction. It's a very useful summary for everything we've just read. And we've got the logical satellites, and we've got the Weltanschauung or world feeling, power and objects of control. And then the next one we've got, it's continued, sorry. Again, more logical satellites. We have the nature of activity, how they view the self, knowledge, truth, moral values and systems, aesthetic values, social and practical values. Okay. Then, in other words, we must try to answer the question: what is the relationship between the mentality and overt behavior or appearance of a given person, group, culture? Are they always also logically consistent with each other, or are they not? Okay, and that's the end of the chapter. Well, I feel my voice beginning to go, so I think I'm going to wrap that up for tonight. But hope everybody's enjoyed me reading that chapter and adding my own commentary on it. Again, I think Sorokin's somebody more people should read and understand, because I think he has many great insights into human culture, especially how it can change over time with these various elements. Today we've largely looked at this introductory chapter where he's gone through what ideational and sensate and what idealistic all mean. I'm tempted in the future week to maybe come back and look at some of the later chapters where we actually start applying a lot of this thought to actual culture, so art, philosophy, writing. People are interested. I'll certainly consider doing that, because I can't think of much else to do in the future. So I'm not sure what next week is going to be, so we'll have to see. Let me just go to entropy and check we've not had any super chats come through on there. Hang on, I've got to refresh it. No, nothing's come through on entropy. Okay. Oh, thank you everybody for watching. So as you know, I'm doing the series on modern Iran. So the next part we'll be looking at the height of the Safavid Empire under Abbas I, Safi, and Abbas II from 1587 to 1666. That will obviously be joined again by hunger. We should be doing that on Saturday, the 26th of April, about the same time as last time, 3 p.m. And of course, I'll do the series every week when I'm able to. So again, thank you everybody for watching, and good night.